Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a story that many of us fear, but many have actually lived. It starts with a phone call or a bruise your child tries to hide. You do what any responsible parent would do. You schedule a meeting. You go in thinking you're going to talk to another adult, find a solution, and end the bullying. But then the parents walk in. Within 5 minutes, you realize something terrifying. The child isn't the problem. The child is just a mirror. In this story, we follow a father named Mark as he realizes that sometimes you can't reason with the grown-ups because they are the ones teaching the lessons in cruelty. As we go through these 10 chapters, pay close attention to the vocabulary we use for confrontation, advocacy, and standing your ground. These are real-life phrases you can use when life gets difficult. Let's get into Chapter 1.
Mark adjusted his collar in the rearview mirror, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. On the passenger seat sat a small, crumpled piece of paper, the school's official invitation to a parental mediation session. It had all started 3 days ago. His 8-year-old son Leo had come home from soccer practice with a dark purplish bruise blooming across his ribs. At first, Leo claimed he had just tripped over a cone, but Mark knew his son's lying face, the way his eyes darted to the floor and his voice dropped to a whisper. After an hour of gentle coaxing, the truth spilled out. It wasn't an accident. A boy named Silas had pushed him into the metal equipment bench, laughing while Leo gasped for air. According to Leo, this wasn't the first time. Silas had been making his life miserable for months, calling him names and accidentally tripping him in the hallways. Mark felt a surge of protective instinct, a heat rising in his chest that he struggled to suppress. He wanted to march to the boy's house and demand an explanation, but he knew better. He wanted to set a good example for Leo. He wanted to show his son that adults solve problems with words, logic, and empathy. "We'll handle this the right way, Leo," Mark had promised, squeezing his son's shoulder. "His parents probably don't even know what's happening. Once we talk, I'm sure they'll help us put a stop to it." Now, standing before the heavy oak doors of the school office, Mark clutched his briefcase. He was ready to be the bigger person. He was ready for a civil conversation. He had no idea that he was walking into a lion's den.
The school counselor's office was small and smelled of stale coffee and industrial peppermint. Mark sat in a low, plastic chair that made him feel uncomfortably like a student again. He checked his watch for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. He wanted to appear calm and professional, so he opened his notebook and wrote down 3 words: accountability, safety, and resolution. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Gable, the counselor, stepped in with a weary smile. "Thank you for being on time, Mark," she said softly. "The Vances should be here any second." Right on cue, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. A man and a woman marched into the room, and the air immediately felt tighter. Jeff Vance was a large man wearing a tight polo shirt and an expression of pure annoyance. His wife, Sarah, didn't look at Mark or the counselor. She was busy typing a message on her phone, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "Let's make this quick," Jeff barked, not bothering to sit down at first. "I took a long lunch for this." Mark stood up and extended his hand, trying to maintain his composure. "Hello, I'm Mark, Leo's father. I was hoping we could talk about what happened at soccer practice." Jeff looked at Mark's hand as if it were a dirty rag, and then looked Mark in the eye. "I know why we're here," Jeff said, finally sinking into a chair and crossing his muscular arms. "We're here because your kid is sensitive and my kid is a winner. Is that about right?" Mark froze, his hand still hanging in the air. He realized then that there would be no apology today. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the aggressive tapping of Sarah's fingernails against her phone screen. Mark slowly pulled his hand back, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. "Sensitive?" Mark repeated, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Your son pushed Leo into a metal bench hard enough to leave a bruise the size of a grapefruit. That isn't about sensitivity, it's about physical assault." Jeff let out a short, mocking laugh and glanced at his wife, who finally looked up from her screen with a bored expression. "Assault? Give me a break," Jeff scoffed, leaning forward until he was well within Mark's personal space. "It's soccer, not ballet. Kids get bumped. Kids fall down. Maybe if you spent more time toughening him up and less time coddling him, he wouldn't be running to daddy every time someone looks at him funny." Mrs. Gable cleared her throat, her face flushed with discomfort. "Mr. Vance, we have clear guidelines regarding physical contact and bullying behavior. Silas admitted to being the better athlete," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. "Our son is a leader. He's competitive. If your son can't handle the heat on the field, perhaps he should find a hobby that's more appropriate for his temperament." Mark felt a chilling realization wash over him. He had come here expecting to meet parents who would be embarrassed or concerned about their child's behavior. Instead, he was looking at the source of the problem. Silas wasn't just a bad kid. He was a student of the two people sitting across from him. "This isn't about competition," Mark said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "This is about your son being a bully." Jeff stood up abruptly, the plastic chair screeching against the floor. "Careful with your words, neighbor, because in the real world, calling someone a bully is a great way to get your teeth knocked out."
The tension in the office was suffocating, and Mark felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. Mrs. Gable stood up quickly, her hands shaking as she tried to regain control of the room. "Mr. Vance, please sit down," she pleaded. "Threats of violence will only result in an immediate suspension for Silas and a ban from school grounds for you." Jeff stared at Mark for a few more seconds, his eyes full of a strange, predatory satisfaction, before slowly sinking back into his seat. "Fine," Jeff muttered, wiping a hand across his jaw. "But I'm tired of hearing about this. My kid is a lion. You can't expect a lion to play nice with a sheep." Mark looked at Sarah, hoping for a shred of maternal instinct, but she was back to her phone, smiling at a notification. It was in that moment that Mark began to hear the echoes. He remembered Leo telling him that Silas had called him a weak little sheep before pushing him. He remembered Leo saying that Silas bragged about how winners take what they want. The phrases weren't coming from a playground. They were coming from this dinner table. "You're teaching him this," Mark said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You're not just defending him, you're coaching him to be cruel." Sarah looked up, her expression shifting from bored to venomous. "We are teaching him to survive, Mark. The world is a mean place, Mark. We're just making sure our son is at the top of the food chain." Mark realized then that the parental mediation was a complete failure. There was no common ground to be found with people who viewed kindness as a defect. He stood up and closed his notebook with a sharp snap. "We're done here," Mark said to the counselor. He didn't look back at the Vances as he walked out, but he could hear Jeff's muffled laughter following him down the hall. The battle wasn't over. It had just changed shapes. The following Monday, Mark's hope that the meeting might have at least served as a warning was shattered. He was waiting in the carpool lane when he saw Leo walking toward him, his head down and his backpack sagging. Leo didn't say a word as he climbed into the back seat, but Mark could see the redness in his eyes.
"What happened, Leo?" Mark asked, his heart sinking. Leo pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was a drawing of a sheep with Leo's name written across it in bold, jagged letters. "Silas told everyone that our parents had a meeting," Leo whispered. "He said his dad told me that I'm a snitch and that my family is weak." Mark felt a wave of nausea. The Vances hadn't just ignored the mediation, they had gone home and joked about it in front of their son. By trying to handle things the right way, Mark had given Silas fresh ammunition for his attacks. The school's neutral stance was proving to be a shield for the bully rather than a sword for the victim. Later that evening, Mark saw the Vances' black SUV idling at the corner of their street. Jeff Vance was behind the wheel, staring directly at Mark's house with a smug, mocking grin. It wasn't just a playground spat anymore. It was a campaign of intimidation led by an adult who never grew up. Mark realized that playing by the rules was only working because the Vances knew he followed them. "I'm sorry, Leo," Mark said, looking at the drawing. "I thought I could talk sense into them. But some people don't want to hear sense. They only want to hear power." Mark stayed up late that night, staring at the empty street, realizing he needed a completely different strategy. The tension finally boiled over on Tuesday evening at the local grocery store. Mark was in the produce aisle, picking out apples, when a heavy shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Jeff Vance standing just a few inches away, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. "Buying more soft food for your soft kid?" Jeff asked, his voice booming loud enough for other shoppers to turn their heads. Mark didn't take the bait. He simply tried to move his cart around the larger man. But Jeff stepped to the side, blocking the path with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You think those little notes you're sending to the school are going to change anything?" Jeff hissed, leaning in close. "The principal is an old friend of mine. We play golf on Sundays. Your complaints go straight into the trash." Mark felt a flash of heat, but he kept his hands firmly on the handle of his cart. "This isn't a game, Jeff," Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your son is hurting people because he thinks you'll always protect him." Jeff laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the refrigerated cases. "I'm not just protecting him, Mark. I'm proud of him. He's got the killer instinct." Then Jeff leaned in even closer, his face inches from Mark's, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Stay out of our way. If I hear another word from the school about Silas, I won't be sending a counselor to talk to you. I'll come find you myself." Jeff patted Mark's shoulder, a condescending, heavy thud, and walked away, whistling a cheerful tune. Mark stood frozen in the aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then that he wasn't just dealing with a playground bully, he was dealing with a neighborhood predator. The right way was officially over. That night, Mark sat in the living room, watching Leo try to focus on his homework. The boy's shoulders were hunched, a physical manifestation of the weight he was carrying. Mark knew he couldn't change the Vances, and he couldn't rely on a school system that was being manipulated by Jeff's golf buddies. The only thing he could change was the way Leo saw himself. The next afternoon, instead of going home after school, Mark pulled into the parking lot of a local martial arts gym. The sign on the door was simple: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Inside, the air was thick with the sound of bare feet hitting mats and the rhythmic breathing of athletes. "I don't want to fight, Dad," Leo whispered, clinging to the car door handle. Mark knelt down so he was at eye level with his son. "This isn't about fighting, Leo. It's about knowing that you can stand your ground. Bullying thrives on the fear of what might happen. If you know how to protect yourself, that fear loses its power over you." They walked in together, and Mark met the head instructor, a calm man named Coach Silva.
Mark explained the situation, and Silva nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the cycle of aggression. "We don't teach kids to be lions like Jeff Vance does," Silva said, glancing at Leo. "We teach them to be like water, hard to break, impossible to trap, and powerful when they need to be." For the first hour, Leo stood on the edge of the mat, hesitant and unsure. But by the end of the session, he was practicing his first basic stance, his chin up and his feet planted firmly. Mark watched from the sidelines, feeling a different kind of hope, a hope that didn't rely on the Vance's permission to exist.
Mark didn't stop at the gym. He knew he had to fight the Vances on two fronts. While Leo worked on his physical confidence, Mark began a different kind of work, a paper trail. He started by emailing the school board, bypassing the principal who played golf with Jeff. Mark spent his evenings at the kitchen table, meticulously documenting every incident, every bruise, and every threat. He realized that Jeff Vance's power came from silence and the assumption that everyone was too afraid to speak up. Mark decided to test that theory. He reached out to a few other parents from Leo's soccer team, inviting them for coffee under the guise of team planning. When they met at a local cafe, Mark was careful. "My son has been having a hard time with Silas Vance," Mark said, watching their reactions closely. The tension at the table was immediate. One mother, Elena, looked around nervously before leaning in. "My daughter won't even go to the playground if she sees Silas there," she whispered. "But Jeff, he owns half the commercial real estate in this town. People are afraid of what he'll do to their businesses." Slowly, the stories began to pour out. It wasn't just Silas. It was a years-long pattern of the Vance family using their wealth and aggression to bulldoze anyone in their path. Mark realized he had tapped into a hidden reservoir of resentment and fear. "If we go to the board individually, he can crush us," Mark told the group, his voice firm. "But if we go as a collective, with dates, times, and witness accounts, he can't ignore all of us." A whisper network was turning into an organized resistance. For the first time in months, Mark didn't feel like a man standing alone against a giant. He was building a wall, brick by brick, and the Vances had no idea it was coming.
The breaking point arrived during the annual school field day, an event usually filled with laughter and friendly competition. Mark stood on the sidelines, his eyes fixed on Leo. The boy looked different now. His posture was straight, and he was laughing with a small group of friends he had recently made. But the atmosphere shifted when the Vance family arrived, walking across the grass as if they owned the soil beneath their feet. Silas immediately headed toward Leo's group, his face twisted into the familiar sneer of a boy who expected everyone to scatter. "Hey, sheep!" Silas shouted, stepping into Leo's personal space. "My dad said you're still a loser no matter how many karate classes you take." The crowd of parents went silent, sensing the impending collision. Jeff Vance stood a few yards away, arms crossed, waiting for his son to dominate the scene. But Leo didn't flinch, he didn't run, and he didn't cry. "I'm not a sheep, Silas, and you're not a lion. You're just a bully." Furious at the lack of fear, Silas lunged forward, trying to shove Leo to the ground, just as he had done at soccer practice. In one fluid motion, Leo stepped to the side, used Silas's own momentum against him, and safely guided the boy to the grass. It wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration of total control. Jeff Vance let out a roar of anger and began charging toward the kids, his face purple with rage. "You little brat! Nobody touches my son!" But before Jeff could reach the kids, Mark stepped forward, blocking his path. And he wasn't alone. Elena stood beside him, along with 3 other fathers and 2 mothers Mark had met at the cafe. They formed a human wall between the aggressor and the children. "That's enough, Jeff," Mark said, his voice echoing across the field.
The principal hurried over, but this time he saw the row of parents, all of whom were holding their phones, recording the entire confrontation. The golf buddy protection had evaporated in the face of public evidence and a unified community. Jeff looked at the wall of determined faces, then at the cameras, and finally at his son, who was sitting on the grass, looking small and defeated. For the first time, the predator realized he was the one being hunted.
The aftermath of Field Day was swift and decisive. With the video evidence and the collective testimony of the Whisper Network, the school board could no longer look the other way. Jeff Vance tried to use his influence one last time, but the golf buddy excuses didn't work against a dozen formal written complaints and a potential lawsuit. A week later, Mark watched from his front window as a moving truck backed into the Vances' driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, but there was a new sense of peace in the air, as if a dark cloud had finally moved on. Jeff didn't look at Mark's house as he loaded the last of the boxes. The smug, predatory grin was gone, replaced by a tense, hurried frown. Mark walked into the kitchen, where Leo was eating breakfast, his school bag already packed and sitting by the door. "Ready for school, Leo?" Mark asked, pouring a cup of coffee. Leo looked up and nodded, but this time he didn't check the window to see if the black SUV was idling at the corner. "I was thinking about Silas," Leo said quietly. "I hope he finds a place where he doesn't feel like he has to be a lion all the time." Mark was struck by his son's empathy, a strength that Jeff Vance would never understand and could never take away. As they walked to the car together, Leo stood tall, his stride confident and his eyes bright. Mark realized that the right way hadn't been about winning a fight or forcing an apology. It had been about showing his son that while you can't control the cruelty of others, you can always control your own character. The Vances were gone, but the lesson remained. The loudest voice in the room isn't the strongest. The one that stands for the truth is. Mark started the engine, and as they drove toward the school, he knew that whatever real-life problems came next, they were ready to face them together.
The story of Mark and Leo reminds us that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. When we face people who refuse to follow the rules of kindness, the best solution isn't to become like them. Instead, it is to build a community, document the truth, and empower the next generation to stand tall. Mark didn't just stop a bully, he showed his son that integrity is a shield that no amount of aggression can pierce. Thank you for watching The Bully's Parent. Dealing with difficult people is one of the hardest parts of real life, but it's also where we use some of our most important English vocabulary. Today, we looked at phrases like standing your ground, the breaking point, and taking the high road. How would you have handled a parent like Jeff Vance? Have you ever had to be an advocate for someone you love? Let me know in the comments. I love reading your stories and seeing how you apply these English lessons to your own lives. You can find all the vocabulary of the story down below in the description box. If you found this story helpful for your English journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating these stories for you. See you in the next video, where we'll tackle another real-life problem together. Keep practicing and keep standing tall. See you in the next story. Goodbye.